James, welcome to the Built for Trust podcast. I am so psyched to talk to you. So psyched.
I'm thrilled to be here, Nick. Happy to be here. Looking forward to the
Oh,
discussion.
yeah, me too. I've actually been looking forward to this all week. So great. So again, thanks for taking the time, to chat. So, I know you. I think I know you pretty well. We've spent a good amount of time. You've been on the steering committee within the collaborative. You really helped kind of push the whole cloud security notification framework, forward. You've just made so many great contributions to the community, the ONU community. And I'm sure a lot of folks there know who you are, but maybe there are others who don't. So I want to give you some time to share, your career and your experience, and kind of what brought you to where you are now. So, and I'll tell you, for those, who don't know James, you are in for such a treat. It's you're so soft spoken, the matter of fact on big issues. So James, yeah. So your
Sure.
career.
Sure. So I'll start at the beginning of the professional career, because I don't want to go clear back to when I was a dishwasher making $1.25 in an hour. No, I'm kidding. So started my technology career at a company called Trinity Industries. At the time, they were Fortune 500. I don't know if they still are. Most people don't know the name, but they make heavy steel products. In fact, I used to say we're into heavy metal. They make rolled steel and
Cool.
guardrails and structural steel and rail cars and tank cars and all sorts of heavy duty manufacturing products. And
Mm.
I won't, it's too long of a story to tell you how I tripped into that job, but I tripped into that job and they put me in technology, even though I didn't really have a technology background. I don't have a computer science degree or any of that stuff. They
Mm.
called me the litigation support specialist, right? Anyway, I spent 8 years at Trinity and sort of moved my way up to, at the point that I left Trinity, I was effectively, in today's terms, you would have called me the CTO. I kind of had
Mhm.
operations. I had the data center, which we were using System 36s and 38s and backbacks and all sorts of stuff, which ages me, I know. But anyway, that's kind of where I cut my teeth. I was configuring telephone switches and ran the help desk and all that kind of stuff, right?
So this had to be
The
70s, 80s.
This was 80s. Yeah, that's exactly right. I started
Okay.
there in 89 basically, right?
Yeah.
And so there were very few PCs, and part of why I was able to get a job there is because I had a PC at home, right, and I knew how to use the thing.
Mm.
And they were looking for a way to help them prepare some information around a lawsuit that was going on about a hotel that had been in Manhattan. And problem is, it would take 20 minutes to tell that story, so I'll skip that part. But that's how I got
Mm.
into technology to begin with, right? I spent a bunch of time
Mm.
there, and the vice president of MIS, which also ages it a bit, at Trinity, left and went up to GE and went to work in the Northeast for GE Capital, one of the
Mm.
28 GE Capital bubbles, and this was in the mid 90s. And in 1997, he
Mm.
called me up and said, "Hey, James, I got a job for you. You'd be willing to come up and move to the Northeast and go to work for this company called GE Capital. They're in the financial services business. They're growing like crazy, and they're growing through acquisitions. And we really need somebody that can come in. And the problem is we've bought all these companies and we've got 14 help desks and 6 different data center groups. And we need somebody to just come in and pull this whole thing together."
Mm.
And by the way, the other thing we're worried about is this thing called Y2K, because this was in 1997. Everybody was
Yeah.
worried about Y2K and the world coming to an end at that point.
Yeah.
So I basically moved up to the Northeast, doubled my salary, which is fantastic at the time, and
Yeah.
lived in Danbury and New Fairfield, Connecticut, and spent time there up through 2000. And we got through Y2K. The world didn't come to an end. And at
Yeah.
that point, for family reasons, I was looking to get myself relocated back down to Texas because of family reasons.
Yep.
And so I went
Hmm.
into the boss. I said, "Hey, boss, I really love working for GE, but I really need to find something in Texas." And she's like, "Well, let me take a look, see what I can find." They came back after a month or two and said, "There isn't really any. You have a big job, you have a big team and a big budget. There's not really anything big enough in Texas for you. But
Mm.
the global CIO for all of big GE has begun to be concerned about this thing called cybersecurity. So what do you know about
Yeah.
information security? And I said, oh, you mean like the RACF and ACF, two guys that do all the identity and access management, because that's about all I knew about security at the moment.
Mm.
So anyway, long story short, she said, well, here's what I'll tell you what I'll do. If you're willing to take on this job as an executive man, a VP is the way to think about that, and build out a cybersecurity program, I'll relocate you to Texas. She said, the bad news is you're going to go from a $40 million budget and a couple of hundred people to you and three other people. And that's it. One person
Oh.
based in Tokyo,
Mm.
Japan, one person based in Melbourne, Australia, and one person based in Cologne, Germany. And you all get to build out the cybersecurity program at GE. So that was how I stepped in 2000. I was in the middle of 2000. That's how I stepped into the security game. And at the time, I would
Mm.
have told you I'd only be there a year or two and then I'm going to go be a big CIO somewhere. But of course, I fell in love with security and have been there ever since, right?
Yeah.
And so I worked at GE for 20 years. And when Jeff got ready to sell off most of the financial services business, I stayed
Yeah.
put and helped him with the divestiture of all that.
Mm.
And then I full up retired with GE in 2017. And then the CTO for Cigna reached out, found out I was retiring, and was like, oh my
Mm.
God, we really need a CISO here. Will you come talk to us? So I flew up and talked to Cigna and ended up spending 7 years at Cigna as their global CISO, helped mature that program out, and retired technically at the end of 2023 with Cigna. Right.
Yeah.
And now, as I just mentioned to you a little bit earlier, I've now stepped in an interim role. It's only
Yeah.
interim as the
Mm.
global CISO for Pfizer. So I'm helping them
Mm.
continue to move their program forward as they search for a long-term CISO. So that was pretty
Yeah.
long-winded there, but at least gives you a sense for the background.
I thought it was fascinating, myself, that's like, I love everybody's like journey and their story. It provides like so much color, to everything that now you're about to talk about and that you're about to say. So I thought it was great. Like actually the GE story and that career where it's like three people, and you're all kind of like widely distributed across, the globe. At the end of that, when you did retire, how big did the organization get and how big was that budget?
Um, that's a great question. Look, because so the thing I probably should add a little context to, Nick, is so I was one for the big GE Capital business unit that I had. Gary
Yeah.
Reiner, the big CIO, had asked each of the big GE businesses, and this is back in the day when GE was 350,000 people and we had, giant businesses.
Yeah.
So just to add a little context, it was me and us for the GE Capital business that I was over, right?
Yeah.
But there were similar people that were put together, and that ended up formulating what's became famously known as the GE Security Council, right?
Yeah.
And so within our business, the team grew pretty large. We probably had 400 or 450 people and a large budget. But that was
Mm.
just that one GE
Just
Capital
capital.
business across
Yeah.
large GE. I mean, I don't even know the number, but it's literally, thousands of people, right? Now at
Yeah.
Cigna, when I left there, we had almost 1,000 people doing cybersecurity and, a large budget, which I probably shouldn't disclose on
Yeah.
live
Yeah. No,
radio,
for
but
sure. Yeah.
large team,
Yeah. Yeah,
very
that's
large
well.
teams.
It's fascinating, really. I think from the GE stuff because that was like a startup, and you actually really got to kind of grow that, like within a Fortune basically 50 company, as well. So yeah, that's a great experience, like organizationally. So you mentioned, so you were both kind of like had your your mind wrapped around organization and organization growth. You also had risk and how to mitigate those risks and particular technologies. And so it seems like you were kind of like juggling like those three, issues or those three kind of disciplines. So it's kind of the technology of security. It's like the actual threats, of security and how to mitigate them, which kind of
Mm-hmm.
ties back to the technology, and then also the organization, as well. What kind of organization do we build? And I think when you took on the GE role, that was right around when what CISO, even the term CISO wasn't like kind of come into vernacular until what, like 2003, 2004 timeframe,
Hmm.
somewhere around there. So you were like right there, James,
Absolutely.
during
Kind
all
of
of
the kind
that.
of kind of the birth of cybersecurity. I mean, it wasn't that security
Yeah,
didn't exist. It hadn't really exploded because the internet was just exploding and PCs at the workplace were just exploding. So you're
yeah,
right. I felt, lucky, and at this point now, looking back, very privileged to have been part of, you know,
yeah.
me and many others of formulating kind of what became the cybersecurity landscape. And I'd be remiss if I didn't give credit. There was a gentleman who was over GE consumer, right? Because I was mostly on the commercial finance side. There was a gentleman named
Mm,
Tony O'Connor who retired, 15 years ago, probably at least maybe even
mm,
20 years ago now. That he, because he was on the consumer side and everything, credit card, everything was being run, auto loans, think anything consumer, right?
yeah,
He was already a well tenured person in the cybersecurity space. And I got to tell you, I learned a lot from Tony O'Connor. I mean, he was the
wow,
mentor that taught me about security and, what to do and how to think about it from a business perspective. And actually went to
yeah,
his retirement in Bristol, England. And, and had, again, it's got to have
mm,
been 20 years ago at this point, but so
awesome.
to your point, there were very few people that you could look and say that person is a business, a business savvy senior leader in the cybersecurity space. There were very
Yeah,
few people,
yeah,
and most of it
yeah,
kicked off in about 2000. To your point,
yeah. Awesome. Yeah, that's great. So it's like, so okay, great. So let's a couple now. I had like so I had shared forever, and talking to the audience, and I was like I had shared like some talking points with James. Now I want to throw all those away. Talk about something like
uh
totally
oh,
different, totally
we're going
different.
off the cuff here. That's
Yeah,
okay.
we're gonna go rogue. So out of those, like, what did you think were like what was the biggest challenges? Was it kind of the threat landscape and the evolving, um, attack surface that kept on expanding? Was it the arms race of the technologies, security technologies that were always kind of coming and going, or was it more organizational and putting in kind of policy and how do you risk mitigation? How do you protect, the organization? So, like,
Sure.
out of all of that, like, what was the most challenging?
Yeah, honestly, it was a kind of a little bit of a mixture of some of the stuff you just went through. I mean, one of the first challenges was trying to, I mean, at the technology level, the technology was exploding and expanding at a dynamic pace, which of course it still is, right? I know eventually we're probably going to talk about generative AI, right? So it
Yeah.
continues to explode. So, and to be honest, back then there weren't that many tools. I mean, a lot of the tools that were used, even for basic things like access management, where a lot of stuff was homegrown and built from scripts and this, that, and the other. I mean, the mainframe had some pretty solid tools, but in this new landscape, there weren't a lot of tools. So some of it was a challenge of having to home grow some tools as, as cybersecurity tools came onto the scene. Of course, then you had to do some mitigation to get there. I think the other challenge, which is still a challenge today, I would argue, is being able to communicate between technology and the business, heck, even between cybersecurity and the rest of the technology team, and trying to
Mm,
explain or translate to things that both the business as well as the technology team understands, right? And
mm,
to be honest, what's interesting is I've tended to use. I mean, my spill or how I talk about what are the risks associated with cybersecurity hasn't. What's funny is it hasn't materially changed in 20 years. It
mm,
hasn't. I tend to think that the most big companies, you can put the risks in 4 or 5 pretty simple buckets, and it's buckets that the business can understand.
yeah.
And I can go through those real quick if you want me to. I mean,
Yeah, let's go through those because
sure,
that's super important. That's prioritizing, how you want to kind of look at the world. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm a big believer in, man, put things in fives or less if you can, because people have a hard time remembering once you get beyond that, right? And so if you can simplify stuff up to the highest level, it tends to make it easier for people to understand, digest, and remember. So
Yeah.
from my perspective, those risk buckets, the first one, which is the most important one, is business disruption. Right.
Mm,
And so
yeah.
availability is another way to, a technical term we would say is availability. But at the end
Yeah.
of the day, if systems aren't available, the business is disrupted. So I tend to, that's like number one. And by the way, most technology leaders, that's their North Star. In other words, we're not going to get any credit from the business if we can't even keep the systems up. Right. So
For sure. Yeah.
availability or business disruption is the first one. The second one is unauthorized access. And again, I think you can categorize this simply. It doesn't matter whether it was intentional, malicious, not malicious, accidental. If it's somebody has access to information that they shouldn't have access to, that's unauthorized access, and it's not good for anybody, right?
Mm,
So that's kind of the second bucket, and that's easy to explain to people. People understand what that means.
yeah.
The third one, which is the one that gets the most press, is data leakage or data loss, right? So if you
Yeah.
have a loss of data, whether again, accidental, malicious, doesn't matter. If you left your car and your laptop, you left the laptop in your car and it got stolen, that's still a problem, right? So data leakage or loss, which is the one that tends to get all the headlines, is the
Yeah.
third big bucket. The fourth one is what I think of as, resiliency, right? So you've got to have resiliency and good BCP plans in place when you're going to have a system out so that you're able to recover. So
Yeah.
recoverability, it'd be another way to say that.
Yeah.
And then the final one is actually regulatory non-compliance, right? And
Yeah.
so almost every business, no matter what kind of business you're in, you're under some level of regulatory. And if you're not compliant with that, then that can drive fines, it can drive scrutiny, and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So I tend to say that that those are the key risk buckets for most large companies today, and that
Yeah.
almost all cybersecurity threat, right, which is a different thing, can be tied back to one of those five major risks.
Yeah. So we got, first is business continuity, making sure the business is always available. The second one is unauthorized access. The third one is leakage, independent upon malicious or not malicious. Resiliency, so when actually something does happen, you can actually respond to it really quick. And third is making sure that you're not in violation of any of the regulatory compliance requirements that are met. That, I get
That's
those?
exactly right. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
you're so good because if you have it, if you keep it a five and you keep it simple like that, you can digest it and you can internalize it and you can actually, you know, communicate
That's
it.
right, right, and you can,
So it's good.
and in my view, I've been successful at communicating that up to multiple boards of directors and audit committees, and you know what? They look at me and they go, "Yeah, okay, we know what that means when you say that. You're not
Yeah,
talking about some geeky, cyber term that we have no idea what you're talking about."
yeah,
And
yeah.
now that's
That's
the risk,
perfect.
category. You've got, the threats is kind of a different thing, and you know what, I do the same thing with the threat side. I tend to, and it hasn't varied. It's varied a little bit, but it hasn't varied significantly over the years. I also
Mm,
think you can put most of the cyber threats into, categories, if you will, five categories that are, relatively easy for people to understand. And
Want to go
again,
through those real quick?
sure, happy to go through those as well, right? The
Yeah.
first one, which I think is the one that, honestly gets overlooked more than it should, is mistakes and accidents.
Mm,
Right? And people make mistakes all the time. They misconfigure things. They click on that phishing link. And in fact, if you look at the data very clearly shows that most big breaches today, like in the
mm,
80% range, right, of
yeah.
all breaches, started with somebody doing something they shouldn't have done. Again,
Yeah.
doesn't matter whether it's malicious or accidental. If you click on a phishing link or you misconfigure an S3 bucket and all your information's out on the internet, that's not a good thing. So that's the
Yeah.
first one, is mistakes and accidents. The second one I kind of think of as, organized crime, but I make that bucket pretty wide because I include state-sponsored actors in that,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I can't remember the numbers at 3 trillion now, like in cybercrime dollars. I mean, the numbers are huge. And so,
Huge.
you know what? There's going to be organized crime and state-sponsored organized crime that's going to take
Yeah.
advantage of that as long as the money's there. Um,
Yeah.
and frankly, you can't do much about the fact. I mean, they have unlimited resources if they're state sponsored. And I know I'm telling you what you already know, but you got Russia, you got Iran, you got China, you got North
North Korea.
Korea, and
Yeah.
exactly, and they're kind of the big four, and make a
Mm.
lot of money off of that. So that second
Yeah.
bucket of threat is I kind of think of it in my head as organized crime, but it's kind of everything in that category. And for companies, that's mostly what they're
Yeah.
worried about.
Mm.
The third one is vulnerabilities, right? And that's never going away, right? And by the way, the
Yeah.
other 15 or 20% is generally some vulnerability, some 0-day exploit that somebody's able to take advantage of on a website.
Yeah.
And I tend to tell the story around the math here, right? Um, Windows 3.1 was about 5 million lines of code, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
Windows 10 was about 55 million lines of code. So
Yeah.
I frame it this way, right? They continue to build faster computers. And you know what happens when you build a faster computer? The software gets larger,
Mm.
like period, right? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
going to write
Mm.
fancier software that's got more capability. And as long as the software is millions of lines of code, it's always going to have bugs and problems in it. Always. You're never going to get away from that. It's not, no one could afford to build Six Sigma software. It would cost $1 billion, right? So
Yeah.
you're always going to have to battle this set of vulnerabilities that are constantly coming at us. So that's the third big bucket. The fourth one is I frame it as sort of unauthorized software, right? So like everybody on the planet that has a
Ah.
machine has got software. Heck, in many cases, people don't even know where they got the software because it's an add-on to Exchange, or it's some quirky little piece of software that helps you, weed through your TikTok videos or whatever it is. The point is, most machines
Mm.
have a lot of unauthorized, untested software, and that also creates risk across the technology or a threat. It's also another threat across the technology landscape. And then the
Yeah.
final one is kind of the one I call there's no patch for stupidity, right? So
Yeah.
you've got the social engineering side, right? And it's
Yeah.
incumbent upon us as the cybersecurity industry to help make people smart enough so that they become cyber savvy and they're less likely to get taken, right?
Yeah.
Which is, a little different than mistakes and accidents. So that's how I tend to frame most threats, I believe, fit in there. And of course, I realized
Mm.
organized crime is a very wide area. Of course, they're
Yeah.
mostly focused today on things like extortion, ransomware, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
you can put that in that bucket of organized crime.
So what would you call the fifth bucket again?
The fifth bucket is kind of the social. It's the lack of education, right? So the
Ah.
threat is the lack of
Yeah.
education. If you haven't
Ah.
educated your user well and they don't know
Um.
that the CEO will never call them and ask them to go get a bunch of Target gift cards, then
Yeah.
it's your fault for not having educated the user well enough to know. Don't expect to get a call from the CEO and ask you to go get Target gift cards. I mean, just as a
Okay.
simple example, right?
I know it's actually that happens to us all the time. For some reason,
Yeah.
like the day before Christmas, like somebody's like texting all of our staff saying, "Hey, Nick wants you to go buy this for somebody." It's like
Exactly.
really, dude. you know,
Yeah. Target gift
um,
cards, that seems unusual, but it's
yeah,
amazing because you know what, it works, right? Or they would stop using it, right? So
that's
they're
right.
able
Yeah,
to still, or they call and say, "Oh my God, I'm one of your biggest suppliers, and I just need you to change the bank account information," and that's another really common tactic, and people fall for that, right?
yeah. So we got, let's see if I'm paying attention, James. All right. So, number one, it was both configuration and user, mistakes. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
Second was organized crime. The third one was vulnerabilities. The fourth one was unauthorized software. And fifth one is really kind of lack of education, on the user
exactly.
part. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Get an
Those are
A
big
plus,
buckets.
man.
Yeah.
Get an A plus.
Hey, I'm paying attention. I'm listening, and I'm learning. All right. So that's great. So great. So we have that whole landscape. Out of that, what out of your kind of career, what would you say was maybe like the top one or the not top two things that came along and you were like, holy shit, like that is like, scary.
Lessons, so sort of lessons learned, I guess, maybe, right? Well,
Yeah.
I'll tell a quick story that's a pretty good one. And I learned this, and this was early on in my cyber career. It was back in 2005, maybe. I don't know. I'm kind of guessing it
Hmm.
was somewhere in that time frame, right?
Okay. Early.
And,
Yeah.
we were doing a joint tabletop exercise. This was at GE, and I won't go too deep so I don't get myself in trouble. It
Yeah.
was at
Don't do
GE,
that.
and we were doing a joint tabletop exercise. I mean, I shouldn't even say tabletop, a full on drill of an active shooter situation. Right. And this was in Danbury, Connecticut. Right. So I don't
Uh-huh.
mind saying the where. Right. I mean, we had the FBI, we had the local police department, we had our physical security team, and then we had my team, the cybersecurity team. Right.
Yeah.
And, when they came into the building and people showed up and we had somebody that played the role of the active shooter, the whole 9 yards. I mean, this was to see how well we would respond. And I can't remember why, but there was some event that happened that everybody kind of went, oh crap, we better do an exercise, make sure we would know what to do if we had an active shooter in one of our facilities. So I'm just
Yeah.
trying to set this up a little bit, right?
Yep.
So
Uh-huh.
boy, I mean, the drill kicked off maybe 9 o'clock in the morning that morning. Immediately, the physical security guys set up their command post, and us cyber guys set up a different command post in a different place. And we started through the process, and the negotiator showed up from the FBI and gets on the phone with this active shooter who is completely pissed off at his fiance. I'm trying to give you a little context here. So I'm pissed off
Hmm.
at my fiance. I've got a gun at her head, and I've got 15 other people in the room with me, and I think she's been cheating, and I want you to share all this data with me. So I want you to give me high level access into your data, or I'm gonna, I'm unhappy, and I think she's been cheating on me. That's the premise of this whole damn thing, right?
Yeah.
And so this went on and on. The negotiator talked back and forth. And you know what we did? Of course, I had my cyber hat on. I'm like, oh my God, there's millions of records of our customers. And you know what we did? You want to
What?
guess? We, we cut
You
off the
opened.
access. We cut off the
Oh.
access so that there was no way he could get to all of this personal data that we didn't want to get leaked out.
Yeah.
That's what we did. I mean, that's the
Okay.
decision that I made and the team made. Oh my God, what if
Yeah.
this guy gets millions of personal information and credit cards? So we cut off all the access. And you know what he
Yeah.
did? He
Shot
shot the
people all.
hostages. He shot
Yeah.
the hostages. Right. And
Wow.
so still today, I tell this story because I learned one of the most valuable lessons I've learned is, oh shit, we should be damn sure thinking and collaborating more tightly with the groups that are key stakeholders to whatever it is we're doing. And we didn't
Yeah.
do that, in that particular instance. Right.
Yeah. You were kind of,
So
yeah, you were thinking about protecting the data and protecting, the brand of a company, so
that's
that
right.
it would be, safe, and yeah, boy, that had to be, keep you up for many nights going forward,
Yeah.
on that.
Fortunately, it was a drill.
Yeah.
Thank
Oh, for
God it was a
sure.
drill,
Thank
right?
God. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I definitely learned a very valuable lesson for me, in the importance of, and you've talked about this before, I know many times, the
Hmm.
importance of building strong trust relationships
Yeah.
across all the critical stakeholders. And
Mm.
part of the problem in cybersecurity today is, can you name a business process that isn't a critical stakeholder? I mean, everything's become so digital now that
Yeah.
literally almost everybody is a critical stakeholder. So it
Yeah.
makes you really have to put your big boy
Mm.
hat on, for lack of a better way to put it, and think broader than, your silo of information.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same reason, if you think about it, that we get in trouble sometimes in the cyberspace of being called the police. Oh, you're just here to slow me down, stop my stuff, and it's the
Yeah.
same thing. You've got to flip that around and say, nope, it's not my job to stop you from doing anything. It's only my job to help you understand what the cyber risk associated with what you're about to do is, and to maybe help you with some alternatives to help mitigate the risk so that you can go and move forward and do what you want to do.
Yeah, well, that's a
You know,
good partnership perspective, because like you're right, like many kind of cyber professionals have the reputation of like the group that says no, to like everything,
absolutely.
so
Still
so
today,
oh yeah,
25 years in, and still we've got that problem, right?
yeah, yeah. So and that actually that's a real what a great example to pull out of a vast career. Because you can see how that applies to so many different things, so many different scenarios when your company is at risk and you have access to the data and people want to get at that data, and what do you do? Um, no, that was great. James, my mind is still kind of reeling from it, even though it was, just a, kind of a rehearsal. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about the state of cybersecurity these days. Like,
Okay.
as a professional who's been in here for, for a good long time, are we gaining, or are we still losing, or is it kind of a draw, with red hats and black hats?
Yeah, yeah. I'm just smiling because, man, it feels like it's still kind of leapfrogging. It feels like you hate to say it's a draw, but it kind of feels like a draw to me right at this point.
Yeah. Mm,
I kind of frame the state as there are three or four kind of macro factors. This is how I would frame it, Nick. There are three or four macro factors in my mind that drive, the way I frame it is that drive most cybersecurity programs today. And I've
yeah.
talked about these in other venues a couple of times, but but they're probably worth talking about because I think it goes to the state of cybersecurity today, right?
Mm,
One of those, and none of these are surprising. I mean, the first one, of course, is that the threat landscape continues to expand, right? I mean, it
yeah.
has $3 trillion. Again, I don't have the number right off the top of my head, but it's big and it's getting worse, right? And that's very clear. And there's tons of data to support that evidence, right?
Um,
So that's a factor that keeps us from being able to gain as it continues to grow, right?
mm,
And the threat landscape continues to get more complicated. And on top of that, and I know we'll probably talk a bit about generative AI, that's just giving them additional tools to make them have
yeah.
even better volume and throughput, right? So that's the first one.
Yeah.
The second one is that at the same time, the both regulators as well as customers are being a lot more prescriptive about what they expect from a cybersecurity program, right? So in the old days,
Mm,
nobody paid too much attention. Now, if I'm going to be a supplier to you, boy, you
yeah.
want to know all this data. You want to tell me I've got to do things a certain way. And the regulators are doing the same thing. SEC comes in and says, you're going to have this in place and this in place. You're going to notify us in 4 days. I mean, there's rules. And by the way, they vary, and there's thousands of them actually if you work
Mm,
globally. And so that
yeah.
creates a hell of a lot of variation in what you have to do as a cyber program. And so I
Mm,
think that also complicates the state of cybersecurity today is that you've got all these variables, right?
yeah.
And from customers and from regulators. The third one is that, um, you know, every company is somewhere on the journey of digital transformation. I hate to use the buzzword, but I can't think of a
Yeah.
better way to describe it. I mean, somebody please tell me a company that's not somehow in the state somewhere along the transition of that. Some are done, and some are just starting, but man, everybody's in it. And the pandemic, of course, I think helped accelerate that to a large degree.
For sure.
And so because of that, then the final macro factor is businesses have now become way more dependent upon the technology ecosystem than they used to be. Right.
Yeah.
So, 10 years ago, maybe 99.99, two nines, four nines was probably good enough, for your
Mm,
availability. Now, in a lot of companies, you need five or six nines,
mm.
and no one should underestimate the additional cost that it takes every time you want to
A
add a
nine.
nine to that. Right.
Yeah. For
But
sure.
that's becoming the world because now, I mean, geez, man, think about even stupid stuff like Google Maps. I mean, half the planet wouldn't be able to find their way to where they were going if Google Maps went down. I mean, there are alternatives like Waze or whatever, but you know what I mean? I mean, the point is everybody's very dependent upon this technology, and that's
For
becoming more
sure.
so the case, right?
Yeah.
I
So it
think
seems like
all of that kind of goes to it. Go ahead. Sorry.
no. Finish your thought. My apologies for
No, I
interrupting.
just was saying that, to me, those macro factors are part of kind of what shows you the state of cybersecurity. And, I do kind of think it's a draw, right? I mean, I think we continue to do additional things to try to protect. The bad guys continue to do additional things to try to take advantage of us. And it's still kind of a back and forth, a leapfrog back and forth today.
Yeah, I think if anything, from like your discussion just now, James, is that well, it may be a draw because like everybody has access to the tools, both both sides, and but like the stakes are bigger, now than maybe where they were before because as you said, every corporation and clearly any public company, and even depending upon the industry sector, has a digital strategy, becoming more digital, is being more interwoven or marbleized, maybe with the technology. You're dependent upon the technology ecosystem to deliver the value, create and deliver the value that your brand is offering, to the marketplace. So
Absolutely.
that sheer fact alone means that the attack vector is large, $3 trillion large. We also know that there is a massive shortage of security engineers,
Hmm.
out there. So it's hard to like close the gap, of the skill set as the kind of attack vector opportunity, increases. It doesn't mean like every company is like vulnerable, but it's like but there is more opportunity, out there. I think for the folks who want to exploit large corporations.
Yeah.
So so then the
Huge
question
talent
is,
gap.
yeah, like what? Yeah, massive. It's
Hmm.
like I think actually you shared this stat with me at the networking summit in Dallas. The ONU summit in Dallas. I think it was like what 750,000 worldwide open recs, for security
Yeah.
engineers.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. And the last time I saw the stats, it was about, I think it had moved to about 600,000. That was just US. I mean, it was almost 3 million globally, right? Now, what's interesting though to me, Nick,
just
is
U.S.
just US alone, right? What's interesting to me, and,
Wow.
I'm assuming we'll probably talk a bit about generative AI, but the
We are right
reality
now.
is that, yeah, that's going to, in theory, right? That's going to help us get to closing some of the gap through automation, right?
Yeah.
And one of the terms I heard at an event I was at, which I won't go into the specifics because I'm not supposed to share the stuff too wide, but I love the quote was simple. It was, the security team of the future will be code,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
100% believe that's an accurate statement, right? In
Yeah.
other words, you look at the speed, and we were talking about the dynamic speed at which technology is increasing. And like, there's no way that, a person can get involved in the future. A person's going to be able to get involved in something and it'd be fast enough to really mitigate the threat. I mean, that's the other kind of way I think about it in my head, right? Even if you look at, I don't know, and I'm going to screw this up. Somebody will probably send a note saying, "Oh, you're totally wrong, James," but you'll get the
Mm.
point, right? 10 years ago, it took the bad guys a week, sometimes longer, to actually exploit a 0-day vulnerability. It took them a while to
Yeah.
figure out, and to operationalize exploiting that, right?
Yeah.
Now that's already down to somewhere between 24 and 48 hours for the most part, right? That's like the average, right? I'm,
Wow.
I have no doubt. I would stand behind my statement that, are you kidding me? In 5 years, that's going to be seconds, right? Or
Yeah.
minutes. It's not going to be days or hours, right?
Yeah.
And there's no way we're going to be able to react fast enough. We're going to have a system that's smart enough and contextual enough to understand that the threat is real and and will take whatever action is necessary to mitigate the risk.
Yeah. So, which brings us right into AI's impact, on kind of security landscaping and defending digital assets, in large corporations. So one, I think, clearly you started to allude to the point around closing the gap, the skill gap, there. And so, can we do that with Gen AI and AGI, in this next 5 year time frame? So I think maybe where do you start, and maybe a little bit more broader than that, James. So, like, your perspective, and you started to get to it. If you want to expand upon that, that would be great. But it's like, what is AI's impact on cybersecurity?
Sure.
How will we, um, you know,
It's,
will the
yeah.
number of tools be reduced? Will the number of incidences maybe be reduced? Will the response time really be increased? Will we get people who have lesser skills? We give them tools so they could be more, effective.
Mhm.
So, your thoughts?
Yeah, and it's I tend to think of particularly generative AI, right? In particular,
Hmm.
right? Because we've had
Yeah.
AI and machine learning around for a while, but for generative AI, this new large language capability, right? I sort of see it as good news and bad news, right? Because the good news is that we're going to be able to use this technology, in my view, to radically speed up, our ability to react to stuff across a technology environment, right?
Hmm.
So that's a plus side. I mean, the bad news, of course, is the bad guys are already doing that, and guess what? They don't have any regulators or anybody else that they pay any attention to. So that
Yeah.
we've already seen volume as well as throughput increase for bad guys, right? From a business perspective, what I tend to say to most companies, and I've said this at Pfizer and I said it at Cigna, right, which is, my opinion is the biggest threat we have, or risk is probably a better word, the biggest risk we have related to generative AI and large language capability today is regulatory unknown, right?
Hmm.
Because we know for a fact that the regulators are going to come in. We've already seen them do that in Europe, and they've come in with some pretty strict rules, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
That's the
whatever,
EU
wherever you're
AI.
spending, exactly,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
wherever, if you're spending, almost every company I know is plowing billions of dollars into generative AI. They have to stay competitive because all their
Yeah.
competitors are doing it. But I think there's a balance. You've got to be careful because that's an unknown, right? My view is, if you're focused on efficiency, right? If you're focused on just pure efficiency, how do we speed a process up? How do we take a call center rep and make their life faster, or an incident handler and make them able to respond to an incident faster? I don't think you'll have any trouble there. But as soon as you start to use it for, particularly like in the healthcare space, for clinical decisioning and things like
Oh.
that,
Yeah.
that's where there's likely to be a lot more scrutiny, right? I mean, do
Yeah.
you really want to go to your doctor and find out that the doctor really didn't make the diagnosis? What's wrong with you? Generative AI is, and I'm not sure we're ready for that yet. Is kind of my
Yeah.
point. So
Hmm.
that's one big risk for companies. And then the other, and I've talked about this a little before, is I call it content authentication. I think that's the other thing that we're underestimating how big a problem that's going to be, right?
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is just, hey, if you think about it, we've spent the last 25 years really focused on authenticating the individual. How do I
Right.
know it's James that's logging into this piece of equipment? And we've spent a lot of time working to authenticate the device. Is this a legit device? Does it have the proper tools on it? Are we going to allow it to connect to our network or download data or whatever it is? We haven't spent much time, in most companies, we haven't spent much time on authenticating the content, right?
Hmm.
And with generative AI, which is, expanding the volume of content that we've got everywhere, it's going to be harder and harder to prove or disprove the authentication of information. And you
Yeah.
can already see that in the problems that we're having with disinformation and misinformation, right? And
Yeah.
even with we're in an election year, as you well know, and there's already China, Russia, everybody's, in the middle of the influence game. And if you think about the core of what the challenge there is, it's how do we prove the information one way or the other? How do we authenticate that the content that you're looking at is accurate,
is accurate,
right?
and it scales, unfortunately, from to the individual, to kind of state sponsored,
Hmm.
content, whether it's manipulation. Like one interesting story, like Martin Casada had a post, and so it was basically in the middle of the night he gets a phone call, and it's his dad, and he's like, "Hey, I just got into an accident. I'm at the hospital." It's like, but there was some twist to like this story where he needed Martine to kind of like wire him some money. And
Hmm.
so anyway, so it turns out that it wasn't his dad. It was like, an AI generated voice that was able to kind of pick up snippets of his dad's voice and be able to have a whole dialogue, with him, So it's like, so that's on a small scale, on an individual,
Hmm.
from someone who knows best. He obviously didn't wire the money, or at all. He kind of caught on after he woke up, a little bit. But also that goes all the way up, and obviously we saw like the images of like a speech that Barack, President Obama gave, and which was
That's
all
right.
AI generated, So it's, yeah, that's unfortunate, but it scares,
It
and it
is.
scales. Yeah.
It
And it
takes
is
takes
scary.
like I think I read a stat somewhere, and I can't tell you now where I read it. So but it takes like seven. I think it takes like 7 seconds now of voice and video of an
Yeah.
individual, and that's all they need.
Yeah.
And they can create a deep fake that's really impressive, right? And
Yeah.
that just gets back to, okay, well, then the challenge here is how do we authenticate that this content, whether it's video, audio, text, doesn't matter. How do we authenticate whether or not it's accurate or not? And I've told the story. I think you heard it, Nick, about the first time I played with generative AI and I had it spit out a bio for me.
Oh,
And one of
yeah.
the things it put on there was it said I'd won a gold medal, an Olympic gold medal in swimming. And but what scares me about it is, we're so digital in today's environment. How long is it going to be before you're going to have a hard time proving I didn't win one? You know what I
Right.
mean? That's what's
Yeah.
kind of scary about it is the kind of inverse. How long before you can't, what the hell's good and bad, what's right and wrong? I mean, that's exactly what I mean by content authentication. And I think the whole world is underestimating, and people smack me later when I'm wrong, but I think they're underestimating how big of a challenge that is going to be as more and more large language module capability gets out there. And I mean,
Hmm.
it's clear to me that I forget now who was on the panel with us at the Dallas event that talked about the models too, and there's going to be winners and losers, and you better not tie
Yeah.
yourself too
To one.
closely to one
Yeah.
particular model because there's going to be winners and losers. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
I do see the upside of large language capability is you can put that in a micro setting. You can put it across a data lake for your technology environment, and man, it can really speed up your ability to react to something that's going on in the environment. So there's some
Yeah.
real pluses, but there's also some things that all of us should be concerned about, right?
Yeah, I wonder if it's like it falls underneath the kind of the bucket of identity, right? So it's like we identify and authenticate the individual, the device, and then that applies rules to like what they have access in. But now also we authenticate or provide identity to the content, and
Mm-hmm.
the contextualization of that content, as
Yeah, and I
well.
mean, think think
Um,
think about the email, right? I mean, and that's been a problem for a long time now, right? I mean, authentication even in email because of spoofing and this, that, and the other, right? And that's still
yeah,
a problem, and we've been battling
still,
that for 20 years, and it's
yeah,
still a problem.
still for sure.
So
Okay,
it's
so I
probably a
have.
similar analogy. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so no, it's okay. No, it's like one of the, it'll be a chronic condition, that will just be, kind of spy versus spy, kind of
Yes.
thing. It's not too bad because it's a tax on everybody to deal with that. But maybe one last thing to kind of like leave everybody with is how do we really utilize this? Like, the podcast was called Built for Trust for
Hmm.
the reason is that we are now really at a wonderful inflection point in the industry where we get to rethink, the kind of infrastructure that we're building to support both legacy workloads as well as new AI based workloads. And so as we're rethinking that, we should really think that, okay, well, how do we build this infrastructure so that developers really trust it, so that infrastructure teams can really trust it, as well. So do you have any thoughts on like, how kind of cloud AI kind of come together, with,
Sure.
policies and so forth, that will
Yeah. Well,
allow us.
yeah, I'm with you. I mean, of course, I would immediately start with, the challenge is it's very easy to lose trust. Right?
Yeah,
I mean, really, at the end of the day, it takes a long time to build trust. It's really easy to lose trust. Just ask CrowdStrike or Change Healthcare, right, or who are going through this battle of
right.
trying to
Yeah,
regain trust, and they probably both will, but it's going to be an uphill battle, right? To
yeah,
me, some of this comes down to what we've been talking about, which is automation, right? In other words, we have to automate more and more systems and processes, right? Anytime you're putting a person in the middle of it, right, you're likely, not going to get the same result every time. You're just not. I mean, that's just the nature of us as a, as a mammal. You know
mm,
what I mean?
yeah,
And so really, in my mind, to get there, we've got to continue the march to automate as much stuff as we can on the back end processes, right? You
yeah,
cannot be putting a person in and out of there, or you're gonna make mistakes. So that's one way. I think the other, which we touched on quite a bit here, is, and it's easy to say and not so easy to do, is the resiliency piece, right? We've got to get the resiliency out further. We need to be at 6 nines of resiliency across a lot of systems. I mean, there are systems that aren't that important, but you know what I mean? I do think that's a major piece because that's what builds trust,
yeah.
and if you're down, people don't remember the 478,000 hours you were up. They remember the 2 hours you were down. You know what I mean?
Unfortunately, so
Which,
true.
yeah. So I do think resiliency is one of the critical components. Is my point to trust, and that's the other term I would use here is fragility, right? So the other thing that's happened to all of us, and I didn't really touch on this, but the our technology ecosystems are just becoming completely so complex. It's not even funny. I've begun to call it the
Yeah.
Frankenstein ecosystem. We're connected to
Mm,
thousands, some cases millions of customers, suppliers, other third
yeah.
parties, partners, brokers, law firms, the list goes on and on. And so we have this spider web, spaghetti web of technology that we're all connected to. So we can't even control, we can only control a little piece of that. And so I think we have to
Yeah.
find the fragile, or we have to find the fragility across that technology environment and work to make sure that we build
Mm,
stronger resiliency where we have these, critical points across the technology ecosystem. Because if you don't do that,
good point.
stuff's still going to fail. So I do think that's another critical component, is us all working together to understand where those fragile points are in our ecosystem, right? And by the way, we could probably talk
Yeah.
another 30 minutes about that's also helping protect the United States of America. I mean, there's a larger thing
Yeah.
there that we are all a part of, right?
Yeah.
That we have to pay attention to. So I do think that's one of the other big components, right, is to understand where those fragility points are for
Yeah.
all of us and try to
Kind of the
help each
weakest
other.
link in that, in that complex web of interconnectedness. We are a connected community, of businesses, at the end of the day. You're right.
And consumers, right? And the consumers
And
are
the,
the consumers are and the businesses are all becoming one big giant spider web of connectivity, right? And then
yeah.
the final thing I would probably say, Nick, would be I think because of all that, I think we all have to work harder or smarter at being very outcome driven, right? And the other,
Yeah,
the meaner way I'll say that is we got to be less profit driven. And I'm say that with a grain of salt. I know we're all trying to make money. I get it, but you've got to
mm,
also be outcome driven. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Because if you're not, a lot of times you're making the decision based on profit alone. You're not maybe making the best decision for the overarching community, whether we're
yeah,
talking about our ecosystem or, the protection of the assets of the United States.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's a great point to leave it at, and let everybody kind of ponder, that concept, as we end. So, James,
Sounds
it's
good.
always so much fun to talk to you because like everything is spoken, in language that everyone can understand. Kind of you do a great job breaking down kind of complex concepts and situations in ways that everyone can grasp. So thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your thought leadership, and congrats, over at Pfizer. I'm sure you'll do great. It's a great company, great American company, and um, you know, um, and they're lucky to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nick. It's always a
Mm,
good discussion.
yeah.
Looking forward to the event in New York.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, James.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone.